You got it. Oh, wait, tell her. Yeah. No, you can't go upset us like I love you. I did. I got there. And I had to say, no. Post it on Twitter. It's not Twitter. Fan down. Yeah, you gotta do it together. Just I don't care.
Yeah, you're excited.
Did you see it? I did.
Are you excited?
No, I didn't hang out.
That's on. That's been transcribed and recorded.
And that's right.
But they just
Hi, Jonathan.
Hey, Dr. Mingus, how you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. Let me see if I can get us in here. Okay. How can I full screen him? I'm going to full screen. No, we're going to watch that. Okay, so we've got like a transcript. Are you guys okay?
yes.
You can see that little picture. Do I need to make Jonathan bigger? How do I do that?
Press him.
Press what?
Press, pin him. Press what? Like the pin. The
The
thumbtack.
pen.
The thumbtack.
I don't want to thumbtack him for everyone. Pin this, okay. Working on our technology. I think the problem was closed captioning. No, what? Give me a second, Jonathan. What am I doing?
The X. The big white button says report up. Yep.
Okay.
Wow. It's much better.
Okay, and then, oh, I know what to do. Click this off.
No.
Yay! That's bigger and better. Okay. I'm sorry. Friends, this is Jonathan. Jonathan, these are like my many people in my class. I have like 77 of them.
Oh, that's a lot bigger than the classes back when I was in your class.
It is a lot bigger. I actually don't
It's,
have 77, I have 36.
Yeah.
I lied, but it's not.
Still a fair bit bigger. I think, what was it back when I was in school? Maybe 15 to 20 at most at any point?
Yes. Jonathan went to the early college. He didn't go to this early college. He went to Davidson early college. Way back when.
It's been 13 years now.
13 years, yes. So, Jonathan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. I'm Jonathan. I was in Dr. Mingus's class, like I said, about 13, 14 years ago. Graduated from the Davidson Early College and then moved to Orlando, Florida to go to school at Full Sail University, originally intending to go into the games industry and be a programmer there. Turns out I didn't much care for actually making games. So I shifted and now I work as a driver developer for AMD.
Why didn't you like games? I've got like half a dozen people in here, and they tell me that their whole lives are all about learning how to game, and they expect to get big careers and work at Red Hat and all this other kind of stuff.
That's what they call it.
Yes.
We're always saying that. We don't show up on it.
So for me, it wound up being that the games industry was a little bit too intensive. I kind of want to keep it at arm's length. So I kind of ended up in a position where I'm in a bit of a balance. I still get to actually work on games quite a bit because I'm driver developer. One of the main things our graphics cards get used for is playing games. So anytime a big title comes out, a lot of people start playing it, a lot of people start finding bugs, and that's where they call me and my team in. So this week, for example, yeah, go ahead.
Does what?
So when they find something, they let us know what's going on, tell us what hardware it's happening on, that kind of thing, and then have us debug and try and figure out, hey, is this something that's on our end, something on the game's end, and then either fix it or communicate to the studio, hey, here's what you need to do to make this not happen anymore. So this week, I've been working on Black Myth Wukong a lot. That one popped up and has been, I think I've worked on 3 or 4 issues for it over the last couple of weeks. So, let's see, Black Myth Wukong was the big one right now. A few months back, I was working on Helldivers 2. Then over the course of my career, I've worked on Forza, let's see, Resident Evil, basically any major title you can think of in the last 10 years or so, even as far back as stuff like BioShock 2. I've worked on, in at least some capacity, fixing bugs.
They're all quite impressed. They're all looking around and looking at one another and going like, wow.
In terms of specific games, though, Forza is probably the one I've done the most work on. I worked pretty directly with the devs from both Turn 10 and Playground Games. So the devs of Motorsport and Horizon. Don't know how many of you play those. I actually don't know how popular Forza is at this point. But I worked on every Forza title from 6 up until the current Horizon games. So it's for a lot of those I was on as frequently as weekly calls with the devs.
And how did you come to your job?
So in my case, I actually found it by applying through LinkedIn, and then it turned out that the office that I work in was maybe a football field away from my apartment at the time. I was living right outside of the University of Central Florida at the time, and our office, or current office, we're actually going to be moving in about 3 months on the dot, actually. December 13th is when we're moving. But the office that I work in now was also right outside of University of Central Florida, so right across the street from where I was living at the time.
And you found it through LinkedIn?
Yep. At the time, I was maybe 2 months out from graduating and was applying to basically any and every job I could find that I met the requirements for. Then I think I had just turned down a studio I was interviewing with in China because I didn't want to move that far. That would have been a bit much for me at the time. And then happened to be, I think, maybe 2 or 3 days later, I got the first email from AMD.
Would you say that carpet bombing technique is something you would recommend?
Would you say that carpet bombing technique is something that you would recommend?
I'm not sure right now. So the job market has shifted quite a bit since I was initially applying. I think that's still likely what you're going to want to be doing as a soon-to-be or recent college grad, especially. I think if there are particular positions that seem more appealing, you should probably tailor your resume to those. Focus in more on the skills that they talk about, that kind of thing. But you can't beat sending out, 100, 200 resumes, making sure that your name is in front of every single person who might be the right one.
Did you make contacts in school that helped you, either as references or as people who could refer you to jobs?
So I haven't actually looked much into shifting my position, but I have made a number of contacts across a lot of former and current AMD employees, obviously. I've worked a few different game studios. I don't know how well those would translate as job contacts. Not a lot of time to, talk when you're neck deep in debug, that kind of thing. But the contacts I've made at AMD, yeah, I'd say if it did worse come to worse and I need to look for something, I've definitely made enough contacts over the last 11 years now I've been there.
Did college prepare? I mean, did you get adequate preparation in college for what you're doing now?
I would say on some fronts. I think the big thing with college is less learning the exact things you're going to be using and more learning how to learn them. So in my case, Full Sail, very much a trade school style of situation. They are teaching you, here's what you're going to be doing to work. And that wound up being very effective for me and making me effective at learning on the job. So most of my actual technical learning that's directly relevant has been more or less from being thrown in the fire. I knew my basic stuff when I came in. I knew how to, write C++, especially was my primary language, and knew basics of programming, some graphics knowledge, a lot of math related to that, of course, and then the actual working, I'd say, was much more learned on the job. The academic projects are going to be a fair bit different. Usually you're not working on existing code bases in those. You're going to be, writing your own thing in school. Whereas once you go into an industry, you're going to be dealing with that company's code base. And it's going to be a lot more learning, hey, here's how stuff works here. Here's the types of algorithms, methodologies, and such we use.
Did your general population courses and stuff help you, like your background in, like, I don't know, English composition and literature and stuff like that?
Weirdly enough, your class has actually been one I've pointed to as one that helped me. So, like I said, the biggest thing is learning how to learn. So in my case, I learned a lot from Dr. Menges when I was in his class, teaching me how to think critically about what I'm actually looking at. So actually analyze the different angles that something is happening from, which winds up being very useful in a technical sense, especially when you're dealing with multiple different teams. So, for example, I'm the team I'm on is the user mode component. So we're going to be, if you're familiar with the graphics API DirectX, that's going to be where I mostly work, is translating DirectX API code into the hardware language that our kernel mode driver can actually understand. And so at any given point, there's something could be going wrong in my code, the kernel mode driver, the hardware itself, the firmware, the OS. I've had to deal with Windows bugs. There's been a few that I've found that have been fixed since.
How many people are on your team?
So on my overarching Orlando D3D team, there's about 40 or 50 of us. On the team that I lead, there's about 4 or 5. So that's a subset of that team. Specifically, most of my work is with APUs now. So that's going to be the integrated graphics on a CPU.
And how do you develop the people skills you need to work with other people?
Honestly, practice. That's going to be the biggest thing, is just making sure you are constantly talking to people, getting more comfortable with asking questions. I know when I first started, I had a lot of trouble getting myself to ask questions. I tended to dig in and kind of spin my wheels trying to figure something out myself, rather than, going 3 feet to the side and asking Rohan in the next cube to explain something. Even though as soon as I did that, I'd get a much, much quicker idea of what was going on. And
do you work with people from all different countries and languages and different backgrounds and stuff? And how do you
yeah. So
come from Davidson County, which is like not the model of culture diversity yet.
No, it is not. Yes, I work with people spanning the entire globe. I work a lot with people in our Hyderabad, India office. We've got a lot of our QA resources are based out of there. I also do a lot of work with our extended team in Shanghai. So we've got, I forget how many people in the office over there that I work with quite a bit.
So do you work with them virtually? How does it work? I mean, our experience with virtuality was like our COVID experience.
Yep.
And that's why
pretty similar to what we're doing right now, actually. Yeah. So we don't use Google Meet, but we use Microsoft Teams is the main communication software we use. And so we'd be doing similar things to this, either video or audio calls during times where we can both be there, or communicating through email for if one of us doesn't want to be awake at 1 a.m, basically.
Do you write code collectively?
Yes. So our code base is shared across all of our different sites. We currently use GitHub as our primary source control method. So that's going to be a way we can write our code, send it out to be reviewed by everyone else on the team. They can offer feedback and explain, hey, maybe don't do it this way, or hey, you might have missed this edge case. Can you double check that this isn't going to be a problem? And so anytime I put out a change for to go into the driver, it has to get looked at by that entire 50-person plus team. And then there's, I believe, 5 to 10 people who have approval power, who can say, yes, you can put that into the driver. I technically have that power, but I don't use it much.
Of course, you're gonna. Jack wants to ask a question.
Oh, go for it.
So say it loud that you're Jack and you're proud.
I'm Jack and I'm proud. So you mentioned GitHub. So you said there's like people who have to approve it higher on chain of command. How long does something like usually take for code in a game or like a program to get approved? Because I know reports that like it takes a long time in some cases for stuff to get approved, and that's what makes like gaming launches get delayed so much.
Yeah, so some of really depends on the kind of change you're putting in. So one of the main things is going to be assessing the risk of the change. So if it's like a one-line change that shouldn't have much functional impact. If it's a one-line change, doesn't have much functional impact, it'll be considered lower risk, so there will be a little less scrutiny on it. But if I'm, implementing a new feature or something like that, that's going to be much more extensive. And I've seen review processes take 2, 3, even more weeks. But I've also seen review processes that are 5 minutes, where it's, yep, we know exactly what this is. That's exactly what it should be doing. It's weird that it wasn't already that way.
Ask another question.
Yeah. Y'all, this you can ask any questions you want.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Open book. Any questions you got?
Okay. I'll ask mine to Brady. All right, cool. So I just want to clarify. So with AMD, when you first were applying to everything, you get the job with AMD. I know that you can get contracted to certain game studios and work for them for a certain amount of time, like move over to their location or online. With AMD, how does that work? Do they contract AMD, or do they have like a certain partnership with AMD?
Yeah, so we actually have a dedicated team for that. That's going to be our ISV team. So that's going to be independent software vendor, I believe. But basically, that's a team that spans the entire globe, and they are people who are very good at the API side of things. So the kind of code that the game studios would be writing. And they will typically have 1 or 2 engineers assigned to any major studio. And those engineers will work very closely, consistently with those studios. So, for example, when I was working on Forza, we had a guy named Thomas, who was one of our primary contacts. He was one of our ISV team based in the UK. Since Playground Games UK-based studio, we wanted somebody local. But depending on the situation, we will either reach out to them or they will reach out to us. Usually, I think we reach out first if it's something we consider a high priority game. So something we expect to be very popular, that kind of thing. But for, most of the major studios, we have long-term existing relationships with them where we will send our engineers over on site as needed, but typically those engineers will still work either from home or in one of our offices most of the time.
I have a question. How do you deal with conflict and disagreement in a professional environment?
That one's tough. So the way I tend to approach it is a very measured response. I might think, hey, what you're saying is stupid, and why are you even saying that? Obviously, that's not going to be what I say. So typically, I will try and word my questions towards someone such that they're less aggressive until someone has pushed back multiple times and isn't getting the hint. That it kind of ramps up a little bit. But in general, I've found that being friendly tends to be the correct way to do things. Everybody's there to work for the most part. So it's, if you come to someone with respect, they will generally respond in kind, has been my experience. And I think that's a really big aspect of it, is regardless of someone's level in the company, what role they have, is you need to show them respect and treat them well, and that tends to minimize those conflicts in the first place. But occasionally you do still have them, and usually the best way is, in my experience, to actually sit down and talk it out. But those are definitely challenging.
Do you ever have to play the boss card?
I have fortunately never had to play the "I'm your boss, do it this way" card. I am very fortunate in that the team I lead is very very well versed in what they're doing and receptive to feedback on what they're doing.
But as the boss, you have to build investment. You have to build engagement in everything you do. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so a lot of the times, I guess, might help to explain how my general workflow on that side is. So I get a fairly steady trickle of tickets that are that's the bug reports, that kind of thing that we get. So when a bug gets found, a ticket gets made, that gets sent to me. From there, depending on the ticket, I will either handle it myself directly or hand it to one of my teammates. And typically, the way I try to build engagement is after 10 plus years at the company, I can usually gauge how rough a ticket is going to be. So for like a lower level engineer, I'll try and steer them towards things that are appropriately difficult for them and make sure to keep in contact with them while they're working on it, make sure they have any resources available they need. And so far, it seems like as long as people are given the resources they need to complete their tasks, they tend to do very well with that.
How do you judge skills? I mean, you judge skills like, is it a quantitative assessment or something? You look at their progress, or can you just, I hate to use the word intuition, but essentially that's what it is. Does your intuition play a role in this?
So intuition definitely has to play a role in it in some capacity. I am not a fan of trying to do everything by rigid metrics. I think that tends to hide the benefits that someone brings to a team. Because if you're just looking, hey, this person closed 20 tickets this week, but this other person only closed 3, that doesn't really see that the person who closed 3 was digging in for 16 hours a day on those, and they were much more technically involved tickets. So the way I tend to judge things is more on when you hit an issue that you can't deal with, is your response to do what I did when I first started, dig in, not ask for help, or do you start seeking out, assistance from me, assistance from other members of the team? And typically that's going to be a stronger indicator for me that someone is going to be successful, is if they are consistently reaching out for help when they need it, and then taking lessons from what they find when they reach out for help.
So,
Oh,
sorry.
Go ahead. Go back.
You mentioned that you worked on the Resident Evil games. Did you work on all of those or just like specific ones? And also like what did that entail on those specific games?
Oh, okay. So I've had a couple tickets for them. I don't remember the specific bugs offhand, but the main ones I would have touched would have been the more recent ones. So that's going to be the Resident Evil 2 remake has been obviously a very big one for us. And same with the 3 remake and 4 remake. Then Village and Biohazard were both. Yeah, so a few things that have come up in there. There's been one that comes up every now and then that we have to look into again, is there's a bit of a shimmer to something. So you'll be looking at like a character model in the game, and they'll have like almost a sparkly effect happening on their hair for some reason, something like that, or on the walls. And my job when that starts happening is figure out, all right, why is the wall sparkling? The wall shouldn't be sparkling.
So that's what a bug is. A bug is like a sparkle or a character glitch, or
can be any number of things. So a lot of the ones we'll see are going to be game crashes. So you're playing the game, all of a sudden, hey, it shut down. Why did my game just stop working? That's going to be a pretty common one. Hangs on the graphics card are going to be, I'd say, the most common one that I deal with at this point. So that's, you sent some work to the GPU, it tried to execute it and got into some kind of bad state. And now we need to figure out, okay, why'd we get into that bad state and why can't the GPU actually run these commands?
Y'all just throw questions out.
I got a question. So you mentioned you worked on Helldivers 2 recently, and like when you work with studios like Arrowhead, how well are you collaborating with the people in that studio? Like, do you work together directly, or is it more indirect?
So it'll depend on the studio and it'll depend on the instance. With Arrowhead, it was we had like 1 degree of separation. I was mostly working through our ISV contact, but I did in a couple cases end up sending an email or two to a couple of the devs over at Arrowhead. Then you've got other cases like Forza where I was working very directly with the devs. We made actually some pretty large suggestions in how that engine was created when it was first moved to PC between me and my coworker Rohan.
So when you're working with them, so a lot of these teams have like designated like backlog engineers that work with the engines. Like a parent company, you know, they own an engine, and then that company, like that development studio, will use that engine. When you come in and work with them, where do those positions? How do you work with them?
So, unfortunately, a lot of my answers are going to be it depends. So, Epic Games is going to be the one that I can point to easily here. Obviously, makes Unreal Engine 5. That's their current big thing used in Fortnite. So that's not one I've worked on much personally, but the guy 2 cubes over from me is constantly talking to Epic because of that. So it'll kind of depend on where we think the issue is. So if we're seeing an issue that we suspect is more of an engine issue, we might work more directly with the engine developers. So some Epic, Unity, one of those. But if it's a game that's based on those engines, and then that studio is reaching out to us, we will more likely work directly with the studio.
How do you how do you like have a work-life balance? How do you work towards that?
So that one very much depends on what I'm doing at the time. So there will be some weeks where I'm working for 80 hours plus, but there are some weeks where I'll have a much slower week and I'm only doing maybe 30 hours just because I've gotten everything handled. It's a little calmer. And so one example of when my work-life balance got very out of whack was when the PS5 was being developed and the current Xbox Series consoles. I was actually involved in some of the emulation side of those. So the pre-silicon, so before we actually had the chips, I was helping run simulations of the chips that those consoles eventually used on massive server clusters in Atlanta.
So you had to bounce. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But
so you worked how many hours that week, or that month, that year?
That was somewhere between 6 months and a year, I think, that I was dealing with that. And yeah, that got very bad. I was working, I would guess, north of 80 hours almost every week. It reached a point where my boss actually took me to the side and told me to go home. That being said, I have done better about maintaining that balance in more recent years. And I think a lot of that comes down to planning and making sure that you have other people who are able to step in if you aren't able to handle something. So in that case, it was a situation where I was one of the first people doing some of the work some of the type of work we were doing. So it kind of all fell to me. And as a response to that, I made sure that the next time we were doing something like that, I had trained 2-3 other people in using those emulators so that if someone needed to be pulled in, it didn't only have to be me. It could be spread out over 3, 4, 5 engineers rather than just one having to handle that. I think a lot of the work-life balance does come down to time management and just making sure that you have everything available. I see somebody trying to ask a question in the back.
Oh yeah. I was gonna ask you if you ever worked on Rainbow Six Siege or racing games.
Say again?
Have you ever worked on the FPS games or sports games?
FPS and sports games? So let's see. FPS games, obviously Call of Duty is still huge. Was huge when I was in high school and has only gotten bigger. And we work on those basically every year. I haven't worked on the more recent titles, but I worked on Black Ops 3, Black Ops 4, and I currently actually do have a ticket for the Modern Warfare remake that I actually have to go back and look into. Sports titles, I've worked on a lot of racing titles. I have an F1 ticket that I'm digging into right now, and then EA Sports, the studio that does a lot of that, actually is also based in Orlando, funny enough. So we do actually work with them a fair bit.
So on the topic of, you were talking about working with places $5 and $8. As graphics are, evolving and we're hitting a level higher than we ever have before, have you noticed an uptick of bugs and issues you've had to deal with, or has, the way you deal with these issues kind of also evolved with, the cards you're working on?
Very much. The workflow now compared to when I started is completely different. So for a few reasons. When I started at AMD, DX12 actually wasn't a thing. I started at AMD in 2013. So it was actually before Vulkan and DX12 were created. I was actually pulled in maybe 6 months after DX12 was started to actually help with that. But that alone has been a massive shift in how things work, just because the structure of the API is completely different. In terms of how many bugs we get, and I would say we have gotten an increase in how many of those we get. I'm not sure how much of that is an actual increase and how much of that is I have more visibility to them now. Where when I first started, I was obviously working 1 or 2 tickets at a time, so I only really saw the tickets I was working on. Whereas now, anything that's happening on the chips that I'm responsible for gets funneled to me. So I'll have 20 plus at any given point. I would say that the bugs themselves have gotten significantly more difficult to debug as hardware gets more complex. Stuff like ray tracing, which I expect several of you are familiar with, has increased the complexity of rendering techniques quite a bit. So I've been having to do a lot of learning on the fly as that has gotten more popular. And then we've got additional things. Stuff like work graphs is the current big technological thing that Microsoft is pushing, that I expect will increase that complexity even more based on talking with the team responsible for implementing that currently.
I have a question. Okay, so layoffs. So I know that the field you work in is, everything in game development is pretty in high demand, but As far as like when you're working with studios and layoffs and like mismanagement from like higher up, obviously the industry is so shaky and subject to like layoffs that if you're working with a studio and like half their studio gets laid off because of some mess up, how does that work with you? Are you guys able to like pull out and retreat and be like, oh gosh, no, let's.
So that is definitely one of the major concerns with the game industry side of things, and it is always very disappointing to hear when it happens because it shouldn't need to. It's if things were being done sustainably, those layoffs wouldn't need to happen. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I don't actually have an answer on that one. I've never been working directly with a studio when a round of layoffs happened, so I'm not sure of what the direct impact would be. My expectation would be that because there is a degree of separation between what I do and the studio itself, I would mostly not be aware of it, unfortunately. Oh, go ahead.
So like on that same note, like obviously a lot of those layoffs happen because like people on like higher up, there's a big disconnect between them and the actual developers. I'm not like asking you to be a whistleblower or nothing. Do you see that happen anywhere with specifically to what you do? Like
so I don't know in terms of mismanagement, but I would say there is always going to be a level of disconnect when you're dealing with a corporate environment. I have definitely had to express frustrations with my local management regarding our executives here and there when they maybe don't quite understand why something is important to us, but less important to them. And then there's also, there's very much an amount of disconnect that is just inherent. You're always going to have that when you're talking about someone on the ground level like me versus, say, our CEO, who is obviously has much more wide-reaching impacts with her decisions.
So a lot of times, so recently with like Bungie and Sony, a lot of people got laid off and they had to sign like non-disclosure agreements on like a bunch of other documents saying they won't rat on the executives for laying them off because they're greedy. So what kind of documents did you have to sign when you signed up with AMD?
That's a very good question that I should probably go back and look at more because it's been a while. So for the most part, the NDAs that I have dealt with have mostly dealt with hardware, technology, that type of thing. So not being able to tell you, hey, here's what our next GPU is, and here's what its specs are going to be, all that. I have had to sign a number of NDAs like that. But in terms of things around speaking about the executives, anything like that, I'm not directly aware of any that I have signed. But it's also been quite a while, and it might not be the worst idea for me to go back and double check.
Yeah.
What, just kind of take it into a more universal thing. What early life choices? What life choices? I mean, because I'm asking because these students are now writing their like college essays, and which they talk about experiences and talk about life experiences and stuff. What life experiences that you had early led you down this path to where you are today?
My dad won a PS1 in a raffle. That would be the joking answer.
No, it's not really.
But it's only half joking. So yeah, my dad, when I was maybe 4 or 5, won a PS1 in a raffle. That's how I got started on gaming, and that is a pretty direct path to where I ended up. In terms of actual choices I made, I think going to the early college was actually a very good choice for me. I had run into pretty significant trouble at my middle school with focus issues, not being able to engage with the content, that kind of thing. Whereas the more intensive work of the early college was a little easier for me to keep focused on. That being said, I wasn't perfect on that front. I'm sure Mingus will tell you I had a bit of a problem turning in my homework.
But you're successful today, right?
Fairly, yeah.
It's a marathon. It's not a sprint, right?
Very much so.
And you learn a lot of lessons when you get out of school.
Oh yeah. Honestly, even in school. So moving into college, I had to learn, or honestly, even my last year or two of high school, I was starting to run into trouble where I never really learned how to study until that point. And that caused me major problems. There was actually a risk I was going to fail in my senior year of high school.
But you never had to study, did you? And I'm not being
Yeah.
facetious. I'm just saying.
That was.
I didn't have to study because I was smart enough. And then ultimately, you come to the situation where everybody else is smart, and it's a highly competitive environment, and you have to learn.
Yep, that was very much what I ran into. Was towards the end of my time at the early college, and then while I was at Full Sail, I was suddenly surrounded by people at least as smart as I was, if not smarter, and a lot of them hadn't had it as easy as I did early on, so they had learned and built those skills to actually be able to learn and do better, which I think was actually a pretty big weakness for me at the time, and still one I'm working on. But
well, this is called personal finance course, but I mean, that's not what we're doing here now for like the first month. We're helping them to learn how to transition from where they are now. They're applying to colleges. They're learning the skills that they need because, you're out there on your own, and the early college prepares you a little bit for that college experience, but it's a quantum leap to move from living with your parents, living in a small town, into a large area that we're doing. So that's a lot of what we're doing in this course, is to help them to make the transition. And one of the things, we just saw this big thing on the universal rejection theory. And the universal rejection theory says no matter how smart you are, no matter how good you are, sometimes it just isn't good enough, right? And that's a really hard lesson for me to learn. It was a hard lesson for me to learn. So that's one of the things that we're kind of talking about.
Oh, absolutely. That's learning to deal with the rejection around job applications was brutal. Like that, there's no other word for it. That experience is one of the most disheartening that I've had to deal with. At the time, I think it was 50 or 60 applications I'd sent out before I got my first response, and it's learning to deal with that rejection was a big challenge, and I think it's one that most everyone does wind up having to go through and learn from.
Did you get an interview and still not get the job?
Yep. I interviewed with a casino company out of Tennessee, actually. They made slot machines. I don't know for sure, but I have since come to suspect that the reason I didn't get that job is that I was 20 years old. And I'm fairly certain I wasn't legally allowed to work on slot machines.
Oh my gosh.
It's disappointed, yeah. So what was the biggest risk you took? Because we just got through doing a thing on risks. And I'm asking in two senses. So what was the biggest risk you took in your personal life or even professional life, and not necessarily the biggest risk you took at the job, which is also interesting.
So I do think the biggest risk, personal wise, that I've taken, and to an extent also professionally, was my choice of where I went to school and how I did it. I didn't know for sure that Full Sail was going to pan out, and Full Sail was not cheap. I was very fortunate to only graduate with, I think, $20,000 or $30,000 of debt, compared to, I knew multiple of my classmates who had six figures or more. I think that was definitely one of the biggest personal risks, was taking on a fair amount of debt without knowing for sure I'd have a job to pay it back, while simultaneously moving 600 miles away from home and my nearest family. So I was relatively disconnected from a lot of the safety nets that I would have had back home. Obviously not completely without them, but that one was scary. Yeah, it's learning to live on your own and deal with all of that. It's yeah, a rough time.
Yeah, and I don't make friends well, and I'm not very social. I'm not really good at like outreach to people and stuff like that. So how do you make that transition to learning how to make friends and being with friends? And I actually also, I know I've asked this question before, is having friends outside of work is also really good. How do you make that like social life transition?
So in my case, I was very fortunate. The apartment complex that I was living in was very much geared towards student housing at the time. So there was a cafeteria where a lot of us would spend time hanging out in between classes, meals, that kind of thing. So a lot of my current friend group actually came from that, just hanging out in the cafeteria and talking to the people who were also there. There's from there, I have made some friends through work. Obviously, you spend 8 hours plus a day with people every day. You become friendly with at least some of them. There is definitely a struggle to find and maintain friendships outside of work, though. That is one that I still kind of struggle with.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question. So you said when you were getting into college for like game development and everything, you shifted courses to engineering. I understand that is as far as I know, much more stable job, like branch of it, like game development than like if you're a level designer and everything, because you're a lot more like vital to the engine and everything. So you said it was like extreme, like too extreme for you. Can you clarify like what you meant, like why you should?
Yeah, so there is it's not every studio, but especially in your more well-known studios, there is still a bit of a culture of crunch in the games industry, being as highly profit-driven as it is and as cycle-driven as it is. So you're working on a game for 1-2 years, and it has to be out by this point, or we're going to lose a lot of money, kind of thing. I dealt with a lot of that at Full Sail, and that became something I really didn't want to have be permanent. So Full Sail, very geared towards mimicking industry conditions, is the way I would phrase it. So go ahead.
Sorry. So you said, yeah, you didn't like the crunch element of it, but you were talking about how like you were working overtime, your boss was telling you to get out. So how did
so I will say it is less frequent at AMD than what it was at Full Sail, and talking to a lot of my coworkers are actually former games industry. My understanding is it is less frequent with us, just because we're not as deadline driven. There are still deadlines. We still have to get things done by a certain point to make sure our products come out, but it is much less rigid and hardcore than the crunch culture of the game industry.
So,
Oh,
sorry.
yeah, you're good. Go for it.
All right. So on that same note, I know a big thing that's absent from the industry is like unionization. Do you know of any like unions in the game industry right now that you might be like kind of close to?
So I'm not directly involved with any of them, but I very much support their efforts. I think they're making the exact correct call. I think it's been made very apparent that the games industry doesn't respect its workers in a lot of ways. And I think they are. I don't think they'd be doing this if they thought they had another choice.
Yeah.
Is the way I interpret it. When you're looking at, I'm getting laid off every 6 months to a year, like a lot of these QA teams are, or hey, we finished the project, time to let everybody go.
Yeah.
I think the amount of push for that unionization is because the games industry has pushed them too far. It's but unfortunately, I'm not directly involved with any of them, so can't really speak to how successful they've been or what some of their further goals might be.
So would you say that with engineering and game development, do you think that that side of it needs a union? You say that would like help the process?
I think it can. I think it has to be treated as a tool, just like everything else. I think there are options that aren't that, but I do think, but I will say that the unions are how we got a lot of the things we take for granted in our work lives now. Stuff like 9 to 5, 40-hour work week. That wasn't a given until, labor unions in the 1900s.
Like if there was a union, they could put like standards on crunch.
Right. So that would be one method they could use to combat that. They could say, hey, we are not going to do this. We are going to work a 40-hour week. That is what you're getting.
I want to ask a politically correct question. I mean, is there gender equity where you work at, and how do you fight?
How are you personally fighting sexism today?
Yeah, I mean, how do you deal with that, and what? I mean, that's a very real question. How do you fight sexism in the industry?
No, that's actually an excellent question, and honestly, I wish I was doing more. There is an element of it. I will not pretend there isn't. Software development, game development in particular, is a very male-heavy industry, which some of that comes from culture. There is definitely a culture issue in a lot of cases where people will get overlooked. I have seen a friend of mine have her advice overlooked at the company she worked at, more or less entirely because she was a woman, and it was awful. For my part, I try to be very cognizant of that and make sure that I am taking everyone seriously. I do actually have my team right now is myself, 2 other men, and 1 woman. And I do my best to make sure that I am taking everyone seriously. If someone comes to me and says, hey, here's what I think's going on, I'm going to listen to them regardless. But on an individual level, that isn't necessarily enough. What I think needs to happen is if you see something like this, you need to call it out. It can be in that moment. It can be bringing it up with that person's supervisor later. But I think if we want things to improve, we do have a response.
You're talking about women who are in positions that are discriminated against.
Correct. Women, people of color, doesn't matter. It's anyone who is being treated unfairly regardless of the reason, you need to call that out. That's I have fortunately only had to do that once or twice, but it is a thing I've done. I'm trying to think how much am I allowed to say right now. So yeah, I guess we did have one instance where someone said something that's a little off. It's like, hey, that didn't, not quite sure I liked how that sounded. And my usual approach is to try and take someone aside and be like, hey, what'd you mean with this? I want to make sure I'm not misinterpreting. But also, if it becomes a pattern, I have raised it to someone's manager before.
How do you, what personal resources do you draw upon when you're like in a situation like that?
So when you say personal resources,
I'm just saying it's like you're dealing with like that situation where you're caught in this kind of, you're in a conflicted situation and you're trying to develop the courage, the strength that it takes to stand up to people in positions of power. And what do you call upon, you know, what do you draw upon to be able to do those things? And I'm not talking about spiritual resources or med. I'm just saying it's a really tough question.
So in my case, part of what I'm able to draw on is that I've been here for 10 or 11 years, and largely I'm not one to complain unless it is necessary, I think is the way I'd put it. I might grumble about something, but if I'm directly saying, hey, this is a problem, that tends to get taken seriously. Partially because I've been here for 10 years. And to be perfectly frank, yeah, partially because there is some sexism still going on. I'm masculine presenting, so I get taken more seriously than someone who isn't might be. I think AMD does fairly well on this front, at least in my experience, and they do tend to try and address things when they're brought up. But no company is perfect, and that just means we need to keep striving to continue doing better. From the courage side of it, it to me just feels like something I have to do. It's not I don't think there's much in the way of building the courage as much as I feel a compulsion to do this.
And the risk involved in doing so?
The risk is you stand out. It will draw attention to you potentially. And if you're in a situation where retaliation can occur, it can. And that is unfortunate. But the way we mitigate that risk is by continuing to speak out, do better, make things improve over time. I don't think we'll see the end of that while I'm in this industry. I don't see it ending while I'm in this industry. But I see the opportunity to make it better for those who come after me.
So, okay, so on that note, you said that you work with people globally. Now, as far as diversity goes, when we're talking like people from different countries, they come in, is there any, like, well, what is diversity? I mean, what does discrimination look like on that front usually with the games industry? Because I know there is a lot of sexism. How does that look like xenophobia now?
Yeah, so that kind of thing is harder to quantify. But you might hear someone. It tends to happen in like micro, like just small little things. So like someone commenting that someone's food smells funny, that kind of thing. Just little things where you're needling the people around you are things that can make people less willing to speak up. That's not a specific example, the food thing, just one that I have heard. Then you might see other things like in an interview, if two people do relatively close, but one might need a visa, they're likely going to get overlooked because of that. In that case, less because of racism or anything like that, more because the company doesn't want to pay that extra money to maintain the visa, which I don't agree with. It's if they're the right person for the job, bring them in. It's but you will see an amount of that. I'm less exposed to the more explicit forms, but there is some amount of structure internalized biases, things that you might not even notice. So, go for it.
I don't mean to keep interrupting you. I'm just.
Oh no, you're good. Like this is you guys' time, so.
Yes. Is there any language barriers when you work with people? Like if you work with someone in Japan, per se.
Yeah. Occasionally we do run into some language barriers. Most of our work is done in English, just because we are an English-based company. We're based out of the U.S. But I do work with people whose first language isn't English, and sometimes that leads to confusion, either through maybe we don't structure our sentences quite the same, and it leads to maybe misinterpretation of what's been said. So maybe someone will tell me to try something, and I'll misunderstand because of how it was worded, or the same thing might happen. I'll ask, hey, can you try this, this, and this? But because I'm maybe phrasing it in a more colloquial and like casual manner, some of those phrases and stuff may not translate. So a lot of metaphor and stuff is stuff that you realize, oh wait, no, that makes absolutely no sense if I say that to someone who doesn't know what it means.
I have a question. You said that you live near the University of Central Florida, right?
Yep.
So what was it like being in a city that is it's not defined by its university, but the university is a huge part, and specifically whenever they 2017, 2018, that was a really big undefeated season. So what was it like being
oh man,
with that big of a sports presence and sports team?
I work from home on game days. That's no, the being in that kind of environment was definitely a shift for a few reasons. So like Dr. Mingus said, I'm originally from Davidson County, a tiny little town called Denton. When I was growing up, there were about 1,100 people in the entire town. And the whole town is about 2 square miles. The University of Central Florida is about 2.5, 3 square miles, and about 60,000 students. Not people, students. So I think the biggest shift for me was just, wait, there's how many people around me? But game day stuff, yeah, it gets very, very hectic. They will actually usually have signs for a week or two before a game saying, hey, this day it's going to be bad. Be aware, traffic's going to be a nightmare through here.
Okay, well, it's been an hour of Jonathan. I'm sorry. Y'all go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, if y'all have more.
Okay.
I'm actually not working this afternoon, so you guys got more questions? Go for it. I can stick around as long as you need.
So, out of college, how much are you expecting to make in this career field?
Straight out of college right now, I don't have a good judge right now of straight out of college. I know when I graduated in 2013, I was hired making $65,000 a year. I believe that has gone up a good amount since then. I think I've heard around 80 is where we're starting E1s right now, but I don't know how accurate that is.
And through the years, how much that increased per year per period?
It's depended on the year. Partially on my own performance, partially on how well the company's doing. When I started, AMD was not doing well. So my raises tended to be smaller, maybe 3% or so. Over the So I started in 2013, so I've been there just over 11 years now, and my salary has roughly doubled in that time. I make about 130,000 a year right now.
Some jaws just dropped, and it's
Yeah.
not a comment on you. It's just
And
I think
then
$1,000 is a lot of money to Stokes County.
yeah, and then technically a little more than that because I'm also paid an amount in stock. That very much depends on how things are going. That can be worthless or pay for the house I'm currently sitting in, depending on how it goes.
I'll just shout out.
Okay,
Jonathan's
so
willing to be here.
so like, I'm assuming your biggest competitors are Nvidia, right?
NVIDIA is going to be a big one. Intel exists. No, I won't talk too much smack. They are actually having a very bad time right now. And I do expect they'll come back at some point, though. I don't expect them to stay down forever. But yeah, right now, our biggest competitor is, very specifically for the part of the company I work for, definitely NVIDIA.
So I know Nvidia has a big thing with AI. Does they do that?
So there is definitely a push for AI machine learning from our side as well right now. I think that is actually where the company itself is making most of its money. The effects on my side haven't been as much yet. They've been slowly kind of bringing me in for some of the machine learning stuff. But yeah, as a company, AMD is very much targeting AI, all of that.
So in the future, do you think AI could start replacing like game development jobs like yours?
They're going to try.
Yeah, they are.
I think it's a terrible idea. I think AI, like everything else, needs to be treated as a tool. I think there's definitely a lot of push for it to be this magic do everything button right now. And I think that's going to bite a lot of people down the line. That being said, the tools are improving and they might get to a point where I'm more impressed. But as of now, I don't think they can replace a human engineer just at all.
There is a lot of like art that goes into like the traditional game development roles that you can't really replicate with AI. Yeah.
Yep.
But there is still a decent amount of like design for what you do, like artistic elements. But like I know that you do engineering, but like when you're working on those glitches, you still have to take those elements into account.
Yeah. So the artistic side, they're going to push that faster, I think. I'm still not a huge fan there, mostly in how they're pushing it. A lot of these AI models are still trained on data that kind of questionable whether they should really be able to use that data to train on it. I think there is very valid and real concern over artists' rights to their works, as it's a lot of the AIs are being trained on work that wasn't intended for that and wasn't licensed for that. That being said, yeah, studios are 100% going to try and push that. Whether it's the right call or not, they are going to try. Whether that takes long term or whether that winds up blowing up in their faces and they realize, oh, wait, no, we do actually still need to hire artists. We're going to have to see.
That's where the unions need to come in.
Correct. That is definitely going to be an area where I expect the unions are going to have a lot of fights.
So, and actually, SAG-AFTRA actually went for voice actors' rights for the AI recently, which is pretty good. But
Yes, that was actually a big thing. Has the strike ended yet? I actually don't remember if they wrapped that up.
okay, I just have one more. I know we're going. When you were like growing up with wanting to be a game developer and everything, what was kind of like the perception going around like locally of the field you wanted to get into? Because a lot of people don't take you seriously until they're in a position like yours where you have a lot of experience and a lot of making money. Once you start making the money you're making, they start to be like, oh well.
Oh wait, that is a real job. Yeah. So there was definitely some question around it. I think that most of the people I was around at the time were supportive, fortunately, but there is definitely an element of that that you'll run into every now and then, where you tell someone, yeah, I do a lot of work on games, that kind of thing. And they're like, oh, you play games all day? No, I wish. That'd be nice if I was getting paid to play them. But it's the end of the day, it's work. It's whatever you're doing, whatever you're making. If you are paying for yourself to live on it, that's work, and it needs to be respected. Which unfortunately not everyone does when it's games industry. I see you in the front. What you got?
You were talking about, I'd love to play them and be awesome for that. But, on a personal level, how much has, your work in the industry and on things like this affected your ability to enjoy, playing a video game? Or are you playing a video game, you're noticing like, oh, there's something there, like.
Oh, that's actually a really good question. And yeah, is actually one that I picked up on a lot. So when I was first out of school, had just finished up Full Sail, I could not play games anymore. I just could not bring myself to do it. I had reached a point where I absolutely hated playing them anymore. And it took me a few months of being out of that like intense final project crunch to really get back from that. But after that, and as I've been working, yeah, I definitely notice things in games that I never would have noticed. I'll notice little quirks of an engine that are common across games. So the Resident Evil engine is used for most of Capcom's games now. So I'll notice something while I'm playing Monster Hunter. Hey, wait! I know that. I know exactly what's going on there. That's that little shimmer on the water. That's their reflections getting a little overblown, because that's a thing that their engine has going on. Or I'll be really excited about certain devs because they don't lock down their games with anti-debug type software. So any dev that doesn't put anti-cheat in their game that prevents me from actually working on their game, that dev suddenly becomes a lot better in my mind.
So, like on this note, when you're playing games and you're like, "Oh, I noticed it," and you might take the enjoyment out of it a little bit because you're like, "I'm getting back to work, analyzing a game while you're playing it." But is that the case? Does it do that?
There's definitely an element of that. I would say it's more I enjoy different parts of games than I used to. So now that I have that knowledge, there is kind of an enjoyment to seeing something in a game and thinking, well, how would I do that? How would I implement this lighting feature or this effect or something? So
that actually was what I was talking about. You said that before with Forza, you were able to push for certain aspects of the game, like to come in. When you have a certain philosophy for like, oh, I see this problem and the studio wants to do this, but actually I really want to push for this to make the game better. Do you You have like hybrid like that conflict with when you work with other studios?
So largely, I haven't run into much of that. That was a bit of a problem in the early days of DX12. So let's see how best to explain this because it's a bit technical. So DX12 required developers to more directly manage the memory that they were using and required them to give these signals to us called barriers that said, hey, I'm about to use this chunk of memory in this way. And that was something that devs had not really had to do before with graphics stuff. So it was kind of a constant issue of having to explain, no, really, you need to do this. Like, this is not optional. I know the game is faster without it. You still have to do it, because it will break things otherwise. I think that's one area where it kind of came up some, but I think most of that push comes from our ISV teams rather than from me or from the teams I directly work with.
What's your favorite project that you've worked on?
That's a hard question. So in terms of, I think it might be Vega. So that's a GPU we put out several years back. It would be probably either Vega or, oh God, what was the external name for it? The 6900 XT or XTX, top end GPU from our previous generation. One of those two would likely be my favorite. Vega, because it's just a weird chip and was a lot of fun to play around with. Navi 20, or not Navi 20, 6900 XT, because it's a that was the same architecture that the PS5 and series consoles were based on. So that was one I was, again, very heavily involved in. That was also one of the only times they've actually shipped me to a different office for work. When we first got the cards back for those, they actually sent me to Canada for a couple of weeks to help get those up and running.
On the same note, what's your least favorite project?
Least favorite? That would be a mobile GPU from about a decade ago that I expect none of you have ever heard of. So for our first generation, or first card of a new generation, it was a very, very small chip that had no video outputs, which meant it had to be used in a configuration called hybrid graphics, where you have the GPU over here rendering things, and then handing it to the integrated graphics over here to actually present. This is going to be a very common thing for laptops. Very good for battery life to be able to do it this way, because you can run your low intensity stuff on the smaller integrated GPU, your high intensity stuff like a game on your big, more power hungry GPU. Oh, go for it.
Okay, so you said before that AMD works with the big publishers, or not the big studios, and they have like their partnerships set up. So how would that work if they wanted, like, if you wanted to work with a smaller team or any team? Do you guys ever work with like smaller development teams?
We do work with some smaller teams. I think it's usually in a smaller capacity, but I believe smaller teams are able to reach out to us in some way. And that being said, usually if they're getting me involved, it's going to be a bigger studio that we're talking to, just because usually the ISVs are able to handle issues from the smaller studios. I think I see someone about midway back with a hand raised.
Yeah.
if you were hypothetically to die today, what is one thing you would have done?
No, that's where I was gonna go with my next question. So yes, if you're thinking about death today, what's one thing that you wish you had done
Before you had died? What is
before you had
the
died?
one thing
And
you
I'm gonna like to segue into that. What piece of advice would you then give them as an old man passing away?
Oh man, y'all are giving me the hard questions today. Shoot. Let's see. One thing I wish I'd done if I were to die today. I'm gonna be honest. I don't know. That is a big existential question.
Okay, they said that you could think about it a little bit and could get back in touch with me later once you figured out the
I'll
answer.
pass that one along to Dr. Mingus, and he can
Okay.
let you know.
What piece of advice would you give them? They're all what? 17, 18? And from your wise and experienced individual to them to help them get through these next 5 years.
Ask
And
questions early. Ask questions often.
Pardon?
Like I'm being 100% serious here. The biggest thing you can do to help your career, to help your honestly life in general, ask for help when you think you need it. Don't hesitate. Reach out. Seek help if it's for a technical problem, if it's for a personal problem, anything like that. Seek that help early. If you don't, it tends to let things fester and get worse. So in my case, I dealt with some mental health issues over the years. I think most people do. In my case, it wound up being undiagnosed ADHD that I only got sorted out in the last year or so. And I genuinely wonder what my life would look like had I realized that's what was going on, 10, 15 years ago. Yeah, I think that's going to be my big one. It is if you need help at work, at school, home, wherever, ask for help. Find someone who knows what you need to know and ask them.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. We're going to let you go so you all talk.
All right. It's good talking to all of you. And I look forward to hearing what you all do from Dr. Mingus.
Thank you, sir. Okay. I'm sorry it was so hot in here. The air conditioner's on. It's hard to hear. You can all don't worry about the chairs. Oh, I see. You drive.
Now,
Ready to drive. I didn't get great. Maybe screw goes off.
no, this man had like 15 rounds of ones at that. And 26 and a half.
Excuse me. Got a couple of cord on it. I guess I can edit it. It's not that big.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, sir.
Anybody help putting these chairs back?
Nope.
Okay.
It's always being recorded. Stop recording.